was your path to your current career? Like I know that you studied economics and public administration in Quebec, but yeah, what was your path to where you are now?
Yeah, well, as you said, Dominic, I'm a economist by, let's say, training. I've always been also interested in in public policies, I would say, at large. Did a very classic, let's say, path from a school of public administration to entering government, the Ministry of Economic Development in Quebec, Canada, working with small and medium enterprises, and trying to see how we can support them in scaling up, and including looking at international opportunities also abroad. Quebec being a small market, there's always this idea that it's important also for Quebec companies to be in touch with what's going on elsewhere in the world. So both this sort of focus on economics, but also the international dimension has always been sort of part of my background and a broad interest in public policies. And then I think the other thread would be I've always been interested in doing research, but doing research that you can actually present to those that are eventually taking the decisions. So that's why for me it was very good to enter after my experience in government to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD in Paris, where you do a lot of statistical work, analysis, studies, but then you do present to the people in their governments who are in charge of the respective portfolio, right? Whether it is about governance reform. I've worked quite a bit in the public governance department, but also people in charge of the environmental portfolio in their country, education, health, and so on. You do present your studies to those that take decision. And finally, that's also the link with my current work at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, since we are a network of scientists that try to establish this sort of link with policymakers, with the UN system. If you wish, we're a bit the knowledge brokers between what science is saying we should do, some of the solutions that science can bring, and also what the UN system and national governments can do. So this focus on science on one side, but also the link, the direct connection with decision making has always been an important part, I would say, in my career.
In terms of you're obviously one of the co-authors of the SDG Index, now the Sustainable Development Report. What was the story behind like the formative stages of that? I know that you collaborated with Guido Schmidt-Traub in particular on that, and obviously Christian Kroll was one of the progenitors of the original. What was that process like in the very beginning for you?
Yeah, well, so in a nutshell, what the SDG Index does is that every year we track what the performance of all the UN member states on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, right? These are the sets of goals that have been adopted by the international community, actually by all UN member states back in 2015. And we have to remember that this is the only, let's say, comprehensive vision adopted internationally that looks at both, social, economic progress, but also environment, climate, biodiversity, and governance issues, right? So it's a very comprehensive framework. There's 17 goals. There's 169 targets. And what we do at the SDSN, working, of course, with many partners, is to look every year at how countries are performing on those 17 SDGs. So in terms of major stages, I think, at the very beginning when we started doing this, there were really a lot of methodological questions, right? Technical questions that needed to be resolved. Which indicators do you select? How do you aggregate across goals? How do you create an overall ranking, scoring, and so on? So we did quite a bit of work, I would say, both internally, but also in making sure that we were getting the necessary checks, external checks, to ensure that was scientifically robust. So we did, we were peer reviewed by Nature Geoscience, Cambridge University Press, but also we got in touch with the European Commission and said, could you do a statistical audit of that report? Because we really want to make sure that we're doing this right. And we've also did that effort of comparing our results vis-a-vis, other assessments that are being done by other organizations to really understand, why for certain goals our estimates, our assessment was slightly different than say what the OECD is presenting or what Eurostat is presenting, for instance. So I would say that was really the first step, was really to make sure we were doing it right. And now increasingly we're moving towards what are sort of the, now that the methodology is stable, we've been doing this since basically 2016, 2017. So it's been a couple of editions. Now it's really about how do we connect the results, the findings with sort of policy messages and the broader discussions around how do we finance this agenda, notably. And so we move from just, basically one illustration of that sort of second phase is that we moved from a report which was called the SDG Index to a report which is now called the Sustainable Development Report, because there is more now than the SDG Index. The index remains the backbone, but there is much more policy discussions and sections.
Whether you want to use your kind of your personal hat or your hat as a as the one of the vice presidents of SDSN, how do you feel about the progress of the SDGs? Obviously, the data and the report speaks for itself, but on a personal level, how do you feel?
Well, first of all, I continue to think that it is an incredible idea, this idea that we establish goals for humanity as a whole that call for eradicating extreme poverty, hunger, access to social protection, healthcare, education for all, fight against income, wealth inequalities, access to water, sanitation, and then also move towards responsible consumption, production, climate action, and then strengthening institutions and international partnerships. I continue to think that this is an incredible idea, and it's the first time in human history that we were able to have or to agree on a common set of goals. Despite differences in cultures, history, and approaches to economic and public policy, all governments around the world managed to say, well, these are goals that we should all be pursuing. And I really hope that this idea of goal-based development can continue, actually, and that obviously now we should maintain our effort to try to do major breakthroughs on this agenda until 2030. But then beyond 2030, I think it will be very important to also have an agenda that continues this sort of goal-based development. So that's the first thing I want to say. In terms of how the world is doing on the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's very clear that the multiple crises that we've been facing, from COVID-19, geopolitical tensions, security crisis, now inflation, probably recession in many parts of the world, which is to come, budget pressures, have led to, these led to major setbacks and reversal in SDG progress. So we were seeing overall, from the moment the SDGs were adopted to, let's say, 2019, that the world was making progress year on year. The overall SDG index was progressing year on year until 2019. Which was notably led by progress in some of the countries and regions in the world that were starting from very low points on the SDGs, right? So major progress in terms of fighting extreme poverty, for instance, but also access to basic infrastructure and services as well. Having said that, even before COVID-19 hit, we were still saying that progress was too slow, that certain goals were not moving in the right direction, and there were obviously major disparities across countries. But on average, the world was progressing on this agenda. Since 2020, basically worldwide, we do not see any more progress on this agenda. Actually, it's stagnation and even reversal in progress in many parts of the world. And what's a little bit sad is that reversal in this progress is happening in particular in countries that are poor and vulnerable, and that did not have the ability, for instance, during COVID-19, to mobilize large amounts of money to finance the urgent expenditure related to the pandemic, but also those recovery plans, as we have been able to do in a lot of the high-income countries, basically. And so that's why all those international summits that have happened, so we're just right after COP27, there was an important G20 meeting also a few days ago, but also we're heading towards a heads of state summit on the SDGs in September 2023. These are all very important to recognize, where we've made progress since 2015, because we're basically at halftime now in this
Mhm.
agenda, but also come up with solutions and renewed commitments on how are we going to restore and accelerate SDG progress over the next couple of years.
You mentioned that what was the SDG index has now been expanded to the Sustainable Development Report, and that one of the features of the most recent report was financing, as you said, and another was spillover effects,
Yeah.
of which the SDSN, with you as co-author, have published many reports by now, including as recent as this week. For you, what is it about spillover effects that requires the focus that you've given it?
Yeah, well, the basic idea behind the spillover effects is that if we consider the SDGs as a global responsibility, right? And if countries, aim to decarbonize their energy system and move towards more responsible consumption and production. Well, that should not be achieved. That decarbonization effort should not be achieved by outsourcing high emitting sectors, right? Whether it's cement or steel to another country, and then simply re-importing that production so that the emissions happen outside of our borders. And so, on paper, everything looks good. We're moving forward in terms of decarbonizing our economy, but actually in terms of overall greenhouse gas emission and carbon emissions, these are just being outsourced and they just happen elsewhere, right? And so that's a little bit the idea behind this spillover effects, is to actually capture those impacts embodied into trade and consumption. There's obviously other types of spillover effects, and I would think about, for instance, financial flows and financial spillovers, tax evasion, profit shifting, unfair tax competition that can undermine the ability of other countries to basically mobilize resources to move towards those goals. And so, as you said, Dominic, at SDSN, we've always considered that integrating those spillover effects, again, considering that the SDGs are a global responsibility and that it makes no difference for climate change, whether greenhouse gas emissions are generated within country's border or in another country for satisfying production. We've always been integrating those indicators in our report. And by the way, that explains also why our results can be sometimes different from other assessments, because we include types of indicators. And on the spillover aspect, I would also say that it's not only about environmental spillovers, but increasingly we also document things like deforestation embodied into our consumption. We also look at how much consumption, especially in rich countries, is leading to resource depletion, including water scarcity in the rest of the world, but also social impacts. So we're able to now that each year, basically through the consumption of textile products, there's about 400 people that die in the world to satisfy the European Union's consumption of textile, and more than 20,000 people that have non-fatal accidents at work. And we just released a study also actually earlier this week, where we've actually identified that through its consumption, the European Union each year, European consumption is associated with 1.2 million cases of forced labor around the world. And we did a deep dive specifically into fossil and mineral materials, which is one of the supply chains where those impacts happen. So the point here is to say we need to track those spillover effects, the effects that we have through consumption. And we also need to actually adopt policies to curb those spillover effects and work with partner countries so that we reduce our global footprint from consumption.
You mentioned the recent COP, and I know that you're going to the COP, the UNFCCC COP that was just in Sharm el Sheikh, but I know that you're also going to the Convention on Biological Diversity COP in Montreal. Is for those respective treaties, which obviously the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC is kind of enmeshed as part of SDG 13, but just I guess the ethos of the Convention on Biological Diversity underpins SDG 14 and 15. How do you feel about the outcome of COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, and how do you feel about the forthcoming CBD COP in Montreal?
Yeah. So, you know, on the COP in Egypt, I think, you know, the outcome of the COP is mixed. I think on the positive side, there's been quite good breakthrough when it comes to recognizing some of the historical responsibilities in terms of emissions and for climate change, and the fact that we need to move into a mechanism, financial mechanisms, to share more fairly globally the costs of losses and damages related to natural and climate events, but also the costs of adapting infrastructure, especially so that the most vulnerable countries that are often not responsible for climate change can finance losses and damages and adaptation. So I think that's at least the political consensus that emerged this year is a move in the right direction. I think, you know, the major aspect where we're not seeing enough progress is in terms of commitments, pledges, and trajectories on the mitigation side, in terms of accelerating the decarbonization of the production system and economies globally. So that's, I think, remains an important loopholes, and it's becoming, you know, harder and harder to stick to that 1.5 degree objective as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. But as you said, I think it's also important. I mean, there is obviously the UNFCCC and the climate COP, but I think on the biodiversity side, it's also really important. And I think, you know, the fact that on the climate side we have the Paris Climate Agreement, sort of a global target, has helped to sort of mobilize actions, energy, momentum around that goal. The fact that we don't have the equivalent of a Paris Climate Agreement for biodiversity might explain why, you know, we're still a little bit lagging behind when it comes to actually global actions on biodiversity. And the numbers are terrible when it comes to biodiversity loss, deforestation, and so on. And just to give a very, you know, practical example is, you know, especially when we look at, for instance, the bees, you know, 70% of what we eat actually requires pollination. And so, you know, as we see, you know, the number of bees basically dropping, there's a real question around, you know, what are we going to do? You know, and you know, this is where I'm not sure that innovation and progress, for instance, replacing bees by drone, will really help us out. I think it's really an issue around how do we prevent this from happening, and how do we also put a price on the natural services that nature is providing to us. So there's big discussions right now around pricing sort of the natural services. But beyond that, I really hope that Montreal can become for biodiversity what Paris has been for climate. So big hopes for the biodiversity conference in Montreal. And it's very important because we see it every year when we do the SDG index, but the biodiversity indicators are really not moving in the right direction at all.
Yeah. Just finally, Guillaume, on a personal level, what if you trace your life, let's say from maybe the beginning of your kind of like tertiary education through to now, what's driven you? Has it been like I know you mentioned at the start of our discussion, like an interest in public policy on an international stage. Have certain values driven what's gotten you to now? What's brought you to where you are, I guess, as a person?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think I've always wanted to try to work for the common good. At least do my best to do something that has a positive impact on the world. And I would say now that I have two kids, I also, you know, always try to think, well, in, you know, they're very young now. I have a small baby and 4 years old, but in 10 or 15 years, when I'll be explaining to them what I'm doing professionally, that I'll be able to demonstrate or show them that I've done my best so that we can actually live in a world where you have opportunities, you are safe, you're not being hit by drafts and heat waves and natural disasters all the time, that we live in a world where there's partnerships, where the multilateral system is able to address some of the challenges of our time. So all of those things that, in my view, can help us basically address those big challenges. So yeah, I would say, you know, my hope is to basically have a positive impact by basically making that connection between what science, data, evidence tells us. I think this is important, especially in this post-truth era and fake news and so on, to try to have groups of people and networks and of scientists that can try to bring the evidence to the policymakers, and then see how we can basically move forward on those sustainable development goals, basically.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for your time. So appreciative. I feel like both yourself and the co-authors of the Sustainable Development Report in particular have done as much for sustainable development and the SDGs as perhaps anyone, really. So yeah, thank you so much, Guillaume. So appreciative.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Thank you.
Thank you.